Throughout history, Black Africans have often been unjustly perceived as a threat by various societies around the world. This perception has deep roots, stemming from a complex interplay of factors, including colonialism, racism, economic competition, and cultural misunderstandings. At the heart of this historical narrative lies the era of European colonialism, where the exploitation of African resources and labor became synonymous with imperial ambition. European powers justify their colonization efforts through the propagation of racist ideologies that portrayed Black Africans as inherently inferior and uncivilized. This dehumanization not only served to rationalize the exploitation and subjugation of African peoples, but also laid the groundwork for the enduring perception of Black Africans as a threat to the established social order. Moreover, economic competition played a significant role in perpetuating this perception, particularly during periods of financial hardship. Dominant groups scapegoated Black Africans as competitors for jobs and resources, fueling resentment and fear. Discriminatory policies and violence against Black communities further reinforced the perception of Black Africans as economic threats, perpetuating cycles of inequality and marginalization. You're welcome to yet another exciting video content. Today's episode delves into an exceptional part of history. We will learn about the reason Black Africans were viewed as threats. Before proceeding, please spare some time to click the like and subscribe button on the video. When you subscribe to the channel, we will notify you whenever we post captivating video content like this one. To our returning subscribers, we would like to say welcome back. Now straight to the video. Cultural misunderstandings and stereotypes further compounded the perception of Black Africans as threatening figures. Western societies often exoticized or caricatured African cultures, viewing them through a lens of primitivism or otherness. These misconceptions not only served to devalue African cultures, but also perpetuated harmful stereotypes and reinforced societal attitudes of fear and mistrust towards Black Africans. European colonialism, exploitation, and transatlantic slave trade. The primary reasons for the historical perception of Black Africans as a threat comes from the era of European colonialism. During European expansion into Africa, beginning in the 15th century, European powers sought to exploit African resources and labor for their economic gain. To justify their colonization efforts, Europeans propagated racist ideologies that portrayed Africans as inferior and uncivilized. This dehumanization served to rationalize the exploitation and subjugation of African peoples. The legacy of European colonialism continues to shape perceptions of Black Africans as a threat, as the effects of colonization are still felt in contemporary society. By examining the historical context of European colonialism, we can understand how these power dynamics perpetuate harmful stereotypes and injustices against Black Africans. The transatlantic slave trade was another consequence of European colonialism that reinforced perceptions of Black Africans as threatening. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and enslaved in the Americas, Europe, and other parts of the world. The transatlantic slave trade stands as one of the most vile and dehumanizing chapters in human history. Beginning in the 15th century and lasting until the 19th century, European powers embarked on a brutal enterprise of capturing, transporting, and exploiting millions of Africans for forced labor in the Americas. Initially, Portuguese traders established trading posts along the African coast, exchanging European goods for African captives. However, it was the growing demand for labor in the emerging plantation economies of the Americas, particularly sugar, that fueled the rapid expansion of the slave trade. Africans were forcibly captured by slave traders, often through raids on villages or by local African rulers who profited from selling captives to European traders. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a harrowing ordeal marked by unimaginable suffering and death. Shackled in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, Africans endured weeks or even months of brutal confinement aboard slave ships, with many succumbing to disease, starvation, or suicide. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans became subjects of brutal exploitation on plantations, mines, and other industries. They had no choice but to toil under grueling conditions, enduring long hours of labor, physical abuse, and inhumane treatment. The institution of slavery stripped Africans of their humanity, reducing them to mere property being bought, sold, and exploited for the profit and convenience of their owners. The transatlantic slave trade had devastating consequences for African societies, resulting in widespread depopulation, social disruption, and economic exploitation. Entire communities were torn apart as millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands and families, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and suffering that continues to reverberate through generations. Furthermore, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to shape the social, economic, and political landscapes of the Americas and beyond. The wealth accumulated from the labor of enslaved Africans fueled the economic growth of European powers and laid the foundation for modern capitalism. The racial hierarchies and inequalities established during slavery persist to this day, perpetuating systemic racism and injustice. Despite the entrenched interests that perpetuated slavery, the transatlantic slave trade was ultimately brought to an end through the tireless efforts of abolitionists and enslaved individuals themselves. Abolitionist movements in Europe and the Americas mobilized public opinion against the slave trade, leading to the passage of laws and treaties abolishing the institution of slavery. Enslaved Africans also resisted their captivity through acts of rebellion, escape, and defiance. From organized revolts on plantations to individual sabotage and resistance, enslaved Africans demonstrated remarkable resilience and courage in the face of unimaginable oppression. The brutal treatment endured by enslaved Africans further entrenched stereotypes of Black inferiority and savagery, perpetuating the notion that they posed a danger to civilized society. The transatlantic slave trade represents a dark and shameful chapter in human history, characterized by cruelty, exploitation, and dehumanization. It stands as a stark reminder of the horrors of racism, colonialism, and unchecked greed. It serves as a testament to the resilience and endurance of those who suffered and resisted. Economic competition and scapegoating economic competition also played a significant role in shaping perceptions of Black Africans as threatening. In many societies, particularly during periods of financial hardship, people saw Black Africans as competitors for their jobs and resources. This competition fueled resentment and fear, which led to discriminatory policies and violence against Black communities. The perception of Black Africans as economic threats is what those in charge used to justify discriminatory practices and policies. In the United States, for example, Black workers were usually excluded from specific industries and faced lower wages and limited opportunities for economic advancement. These systemic barriers perpetuated the perception of Black Africans as threats to the financial status quo and reinforced racial hierarchies. Furthermore, economic competition intersected with other forms of oppression, such as racism and colonialism, to further marginalize Black Africans. Addressing the perception of Black Africans as economic threats requires dismantling systemic barriers and promoting economic opportunities and equity for all individuals, regardless of race or ethnicity. By challenging discriminatory practices and policies, societies can work towards creating a more inclusive and just economic system that benefits everyone. Cultural misunderstandings and stereotypes. Additionally, cultural misunderstandings and stereotypes further contributed to the perception of Black Africans as a threat. Western societies often viewed African cultural practices, languages, and traditions as exotic or primitive, reinforcing negative stereotypes and perceptions. These misconceptions serve to devalue African cultures and contribute to the marginalization of Black communities. The portrayal of Black Africans as exotic or primitive in Western media and literature perpetuates harmful stereotypes and reinforces perceptions of them as threatening or dangerous. These stereotypes not only dehumanized Black Africans, but also justified colonialism and exploitation by portraying them as uncivilized or inferior to Western societies. Moreover, cultural misunderstandings often led to fear and mistrust of Black Africans by dominant groups. Western societies, with their cultural norms and values, usually viewed African cultures and traditions as strange or unfamiliar, leading to a sense of othering and alienation. This cultural divide further contributed to the perception of Black Africans as outsiders or threats to social cohesion. Legacy and contemporary impact. The legacy of these historical perceptions continues to impact contemporary society, manifesting in systemic racism, inequality, and prejudice. From racial profiling and police brutality to disparities in healthcare and education, Black Africans and people of African descent still face discrimination and marginalization based on these historical stereotypes. The pervasive nature of these stereotypes and prejudices underscores the importance of addressing their root causes and working toward meaningful social change. By acknowledging the historical injustices that have shaped perceptions of Black Africans as threats, societies can begin to dismantle the systemic barriers that perpetuate racism and inequality. Furthermore, the impact of those perceptions extends beyond individual interactions to institutional and structural levels. Policies and practices that disproportionately harm Black communities, such as mass incarceration and discriminatory housing policies, stem from historical perceptions of Black Africans as threats. Addressing these systemic injustices requires a comprehensive approach that addresses individual prejudices and institutionalized forms of discrimination. The legacy of historical perceptions of Black Africans as a threat is deeply intertwined with the institutionalized racism perpetuated by laws such as the Jim Crow laws in the United States. These laws, enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, enforced racial segregation and discrimination against Black Americans, further cementing the perception of Black individuals as inferior and dangerous. Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in public facilities, including schools, transportation, restaurants, and restrooms, among others. These laws came about to enforce white supremacy and maintain the social and economic dominance of white Americans over Black Americans. By segregating public spaces and denying Black individuals equal access to resources and opportunities, Jim Crow laws reinforced the perception of Black Americans as second-class citizens and perpetuated systemic inequalities. Civil rights movements that fought for equality. Despite the oppressive nature of Jim Crow laws, Black Americans fought tirelessly for equality and justice through civil rights movements. These movements, which gained momentum throughout the 20th century, aimed to challenge racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement, and to secure equal rights and opportunities for Black individuals. The civil rights movement in the United States was a pivotal struggle for racial equality and justice that spanned several decades, reaching its peak in the 1950s and 1960s. Rooted in the deep-seated injustices of segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement faced by Black Americans, the movement mobilized millions of people in a collective effort to challenge institutionalized racism and demand equal rights and opportunities for all. The seeds of the civil rights movement happened to be sown long before the 1950s, with the abolitionist and Reconstruction movements of the 19th century laying the groundwork for future activism. However, it was the systemic injustices of Jim Crow segregation, reinforced by laws and customs that enforced racial discrimination and inequality, that catalyzed the modern civil rights movement. The 1954 landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, which declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, marked a turning point in the fight against segregation. This decision galvanized activists and provided momentum for the civil rights movement, sparking a wave of protests and legal challenges aimed at dismantling segregation and institutionalized racism. Diverse individuals and organizations led the civil rights movement, each contributing to the struggle in their own unique way. Prominent figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and Ella Baker emerged as influential leaders, inspiring and mobilizing millions through activism, speeches, and organizing efforts. Organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, played instrumental roles in coordinating protests, organizing boycotts, and advocating for legislative change. The civil rights movement employed various tactics and strategies to challenge segregation and discrimination and advance the cause of racial equality. Nonviolent protests, sit-ins, marches, boycotts, and acts of civil disobedience was what they could use to confront injustice and demand change, often at significant personal risk to activists. One of the most famous examples of nonviolent protest was the Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat to a white passenger on a segregated bus. The boycott, organized by the Montgomery Improvement Association and led by Martin Luther King Jr., lasted over a year, ultimately leading to the desegregation of public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama. The efforts of the civil rights movement culminated in significant legislative victories that transformed the legal landscape of the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and prohibited segregation in public facilities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed to protect the voting rights of Black Americans by eliminating discriminatory voting practices, such as literacy tests and poll taxes. The legacy of the civil rights movement is profound and far-reaching, shaping the course of American history and inspiring movements for justice and equality worldwide. The sacrifices and achievements of civil rights activists paved the way for monumental progress in the fight against racism and discrimination, laying the foundation for future generations to continue the struggle for racial equality. While significant strides are in place for advancing civil rights and dismantling systemic racism, the struggle for racial justice is far from over. The ongoing challenges of police brutality, mass incarceration, economic inequality, and voter suppression serve as stark reminders of the enduring legacy of racism and the urgent need for continued activism and advocacy. Addressing historical perceptions. The struggle for civil rights and racial equality continues today, as systemic racism and discrimination persist in various forms. Addressing historical perceptions of Black Africans as a threat requires ongoing efforts to dismantle systemic inequalities, challenge stereotypes, promote empathy and understanding, and advocate for meaningful social change. Education plays a crucial role in addressing historical perceptions and promoting racial equality. By teaching the history of racism, colonialism, and the civil rights movement, as well as the contributions of Black individuals to society, educators can empower students to examine and challenge stereotypes and prejudices critically. Additionally, promoting diversity and inclusion in educational curricula and spaces can foster empathy and understanding among students from different racial and cultural backgrounds. Advocacy and activism are essential for addressing systemic inequalities and promoting racial justice. By advocating for policy reforms, supporting grassroots movements, and participating in community organizing efforts, individuals and organizations can work towards dismantling the structures of racism and discrimination that perpetuate historical perceptions of Black Africans as a threat. Promoting cultural understanding and dialogue is crucial for challenging stereotypes and fostering empathy and solidarity across racial divides. By celebrating diversity, promoting intercultural exchange, and amplifying marginalized voices and perspectives, societies can challenge the perception of Black Africans as a threat and promote a more inclusive and equitable society for all. Finally, historical perceptions of Black Africans as a threat are deeply rooted in colonialism, racism, and institutionalized discrimination, such as Jim Crow laws in the United States. Despite the challenges and injustices they faced, Black individuals and communities have continued to fight for equality and justice through civil rights movements and activism. By acknowledging and confronting these historical injustices, promoting empathy and understanding, and advocating for meaningful social change, societies can work towards dismantling systemic inequalities and creating a future where everyone receives value, respect, and dignity, regardless of race or ethnicity. As we conclude this exciting episode, the historical view of Black Africans as a threat stems deeply from colonialism, racism, economic competition, and cultural misunderstandings. Societies can move towards a more equitable and inclusive future by acknowledging and confronting these historical injustices. Understanding the historical perceptions of Black Africans as a threat is crucial for addressing ongoing systemic injustices and working toward a more equitable future. By unpacking the difficulties of this issue, challenging stereotypes, promoting empathy and understanding, and advocating for meaningful social change, we can create a world where every individual has their value, respect, and dignity. As we strive to create a more just and inclusive society, let us draw upon the lessons of history to inform our efforts and ensure that past injustices will not repeat itself in the present or future. Together, we can build a world where every individual doesn't have to feel less of themselves and can be free from the constraints of prejudice and discrimination. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed this video, kindly hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to get notifications of all our new videos. Also, remember to share this video. See you in our next video. Thank you for watching.